Although Jordan Peterson is somebody who I often find myself at odds with in terms of our views of reality, I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge the great things that Jordan Peterson has achieved through his works. For example, lifting thousands upon thousands of people out of horrible, depressed ruts of lives into more healthy and productive circumstances. Therefore, I think that his work deserves a lot of attention. I think, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps consciously, that Dr. Peterson has also provided a great basis on which to work on to truly illustrate to the average person what great heights they can attain, with perhaps a little bit of additional interpretation, information from other authors, and also some additional thought applied to his rules. And so, acknowledging the vine which Jordan Peterson has perhaps unwittingly put out in the form of Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, I thought that I might provide some of my thoughts, some stories from my own life, and the thoughts of other authors on the general topics that these 12 rules cover, in order to give people a little bit more to think about as it comes to these rules. And so we begin with the very first rule. Rule 1. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Now, when I hear this rule, my mind is immediately brought back to G.K. Chesterton's famous saying in his book The Thing, written in 1929. Some of you may have heard of this. It's called Chesterton's Fence. And Chesterton writes, "There exists in such a case a certain institution or law, let us say, for the sake of simplicity, a fence or gate erected across a road. The more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to it and says, 'I don't see the use of this, let us clear it away.' To which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, 'If you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then, when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it.'" Now, considered in themselves, it would seem as if Jordan Peterson's position is a lot more moderate than G.K. Chesterton's, but I think that when we consider both of the objects in this rule, the social institution and the creative achievement, as two things that correspond together to form an overarching pattern, I think that we can do some very interesting things, particularly as regards the later rules on his list. Let us begin by discussing what I think is one of the worst mistakes that mankind has ever made. A decision that came about in the 18th century, and that is that we would only entertain those things which our mind can fully comprehend. So, this rule of reason, or pure logic, this rule of syllogism, above the rule of what reality actually is, which is a far more complicated and muddled thing than any human being who has ever lived has been able to fully comprehend. From now on, we'll just call this pure reason. This thing that, once upon a time, the vast majority of people were more intelligent than to accept, because, having a certain sense of humility, they understood that much of the world, be it God, be it even the nature itself that they study, is in some sense far above their full comprehension. There was this understanding once, and it has died. And I can tell you that I was, at one point, one of the people who plunged the knife into its chest. For the problem with syllogism is that it isn't able to analyse its first principles. It's not able to even analyse perhaps the particular end to which it's applied. It's simply a set of rules by which we can determine what must be true given other things. And so reason alone is kind of paralysing, because although we can perhaps have self-knowledge in some sense, it's certainly not a purely rational thing. And in fact, I think that this pure reason that we are discussing here is precisely what has led to ideology, and really what leads to the majority of evil acts in the world. For example, when I was about 15 or 16, I was very interested in a girl. I became very, very close friends with her, and I wanted to take it to the next level. But the problem was that there was another man who was competing with me over her. And so I sat and I thought, what am I going to do about this problem? And so, discovering that this man had broken up with his girlfriend, about the week before, I figured that I could play social games and sort of crush him out of the game by telling the X. Now, this may have had some sense of reasoning, but I think that you can immediately see the problem that is in it, and that is the lack of the consideration of morality and other factors. This action was purely out of pride and spite on my part. I didn't consider what the girl I was talking to thought. I didn't consider what the guy thought because we were kind of acquaintances. I didn't consider what his ex might have thought. I just did it out of a sense of pure arrogance, out of pure lack of consideration for everything except the end in mind, which was to, of course, remove my enemy in this situation. And of course I paid for it, because I missed out some things that I should have considered. And so we expose the problem of pure reason. It doesn't sit and consider its ends. It doesn't have a true introspection. It doesn't consider the objectivity of good and evil. It doesn't consider even beauty. It's just a pure, inexorable machine of syllogism, rules, and conclusions. And although this is a relatively speaking mild case in my part, I'm sure that pretty much everybody here watching has done something similar. When we apply this to a societal level, since we have seen since at the very least 1789, we begin to see horrific consequences. For example, let us consider the National Socialists in Germany. They were interested in creating a Volk that was pure, and one of the first things they did in their inexorable advance towards that conclusion was to massacre disabled children and disabled people en masse in Action T4. In addition, when we consider the Soviets and general communist mass, when we remember the words of Engels, who believed that the state would wither away, and the lens which Lenin put on that when he wrote of that in State and Revolution and concluded that it must be violent, it led to the Cheka during the Russian Civil War placing peasants in cages and killing them en masse in those cages. It led to the gulags, which I'm sure you've heard of many times from Dr Peterson. It led to all kinds of horrible suffering on the part of other people just because the syllogism of Marxist ideology demanded it. And lest we forget, even liberalism has blood on its hands. So often we brush under the carpet the Vendée genocide, where hundreds of thousands of Catholics, perhaps up to 130,000, were massacred by the French government for standing up to forced conscription and the civil constitution of the clergy, which the then liberal government put in place. The Cristero War, where the Masonic liberal government in Mexico decided to clamp down on marriage in religious institutions, and so many others. We so often, perhaps because of our isolation, we forget that the liberal revolutions of the 19th and 18th centuries had similar results. Rivers of blood. And this is because, in my opinion, the root of ideology begins in the conception of liberalism and in the conception of the Enlightenment. And so we see the repetition of this logic. In order to fulfill any kind of ideology, there must be an extinguishing of the opposing forces. You have the National Socialists trying to make their race pure, that being their end, and that being followed through to its logical conclusion. You have communism, with this idea of the melting away of the socialist state, and the establishment of socialist regimes in the meantime to continue that stage. You see this executed and followed through to its logical conclusions. And likewise with liberalism. You see the mass denigration of traditional religious structures, the massacring of people who resist, and the granting of rights to those people, but only insofar as the liberal ideology permits. You only have freedom of speech, but only insofar as you don't use that freedom of speech to destroy the liberal system. You are all proletarian brothers, so long as you do not challenge the socialist state, for it is necessitated by the rules of history. We are all one Volk, but don't you dare disagree with the Führer. What is the solution to this, though? What is it that Rousseau, what is it that Marx, what is it that Hitler missed out? What are we not considering? What is this ideological complex that the West has had since, at the very latest, the 1680s? What are we missing? Well, we're reasoning in the wrong way. We have pure reason, but we don't have much else. We have natural law, but nothing else. And so, therefore, if we wish to overcome this consideration of ideology, but also help to stop people from carelessly denigrating social institutions and creative achievement, we have to reintroduce what is meant by beauty and what is meant by the good. To summarize from Plotinus, a 3rd century pagan philosopher, he believes that all beauty is as a result of the one principle of the universe, what we as Christians would call God, but what he calls the One. And this beauty is the access to that higher principle of being. It is above human intellection, for the One is necessarily infinitely above human intellection, but yet we're still given these windows, these portals into considerations beyond reason by this, and therefore greater access to truths which are otherwise unintelligible to human reason. Now, as I'm fairly sure that Plotinus would concur, and also his predecessor, Plato, all beauty is participating in what is known as pure beauty. So, for example, you see a beautiful flower, a beautiful person, a beautiful painting, and these things are not beautiful in themselves, but they're only beautiful insofar as they participate in pure beauty itself. And consequently, the mental contemplation of pure beauty is the acquisition of a greater beauty than anything that we can see with our eyes. Now, this is very difficult for a modern person to understand, where this idea of participation in something that is invisible has largely disappeared. So let us consider the contrary case. Let us consider a case wherein all things are relatively beautiful relative to each other. Now, if this were the case, then there would be nothing grounding standards of beauty. There would be no particular reason why somebody would be more beautiful than another. It would all be a relative game. But say, for example, we have 2 very ugly paintings in the same room. We still know that both of these paintings are ugly, but we may be able to say, oh, one is more attractive than another. But how can we possibly say this without some sort of pure beauty determining what gauge is that beauty? And this is precisely what Plotinus gets at when he says that beauty is a portal to the divine. Because beauty, in a sense, is just an application of being in some way. It's a showing forth that all of the things that are supposed to be in a particular thing are there to the highest level of their flourishing. You know, we're ugly if our eyes are not completely symmetrical. We are considered ugly if we're fat. We're considered ugly if we are lacking some other thing that deviates from the greatest possible form of the human being. It's all intrinsically linked to being, which is why Plotinus links it to the One, for the One is pure being. And which is coincidentally also the view of God that is held by most Christians, by most Muslims, and by most Jews. And it's the same thing with our actions. Something is good when it doesn't have any lack of being in the action, when something is not corrupted. So, for example, when I give money to the poor for the sake of leading them into slavery, that would be an evil, because the end is bad. But if I give to the poor for the sake of them surviving, that would be a good thing, because that would show forth a divine charity. And these things are not articulable to pure reason alone. A lot of this comes from our pure instinct. A lot of this comes from divine revelation. A lot of these things, while they can be reasoned about, simply are not expressible in a syllogism. And this is what we have forgotten. This is precisely what I think that Dr Peterson is trying to defend when he says about the protection of social institutions and creative achievement, because he wants to defend the goodness and the beauty in the world. Because these 2 examples are concrete manifestations of the good and of beauty, creative achievement being beauty, and social institutions being a good because it preserves the order which allows our actions to be correctly ordered and therefore good. But reason alone cannot obtain this. And this is what I mean. When we reason, we cannot use pure reason. We cannot use the ideology of the last 250 years with reason in isolation in itself. We must consider those aspects of the good and those aspects of beauty before we make any decisions about demolishing any fences. Now, you may be asking, what is the greatest of these goods? For I'm sure that what I'm introducing to some of you may be very new, and it's perhaps more obvious than you might think. Because the greatest thing, the greatest good, the greatest beauty that a person can possess is humility. That true self-knowledge of reckoning what one is, as something that is participating in the pure beauty which sustains and creates the world, and realizing their place in that, and then fulfilling it. That is the truest beauty possible. This is also what sin is. The deviation from this realization. This deviation from the purpose which God has granted you. And we can see this especially clearly in the first couple of chapters of Genesis. Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, if memory serves me. God creates man very good. And yet, in the midst of the garden, he places the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, man, dwelling in the garden with his wife Eve, they are created in a state of supreme goodness, and original innocence perhaps, and yet they see this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and despite of the fact that they already know they're good, they already know the supreme good, for God made them to know this, they still take of the fruit, beholding it first of all, sinning in thought, grabbing it and then eating it, sinning through act. And this is what a sin is. It's this deviation from the very goodness that God created with us. And as a result of the fall, we are conceived in iniquity, and so we are somewhat prone to this, but acknowledging this fact allows us to return by God's grace to this original state in this life, and an even greater one in the next. As a closing thought, I want to intimate a thought that was had by a great priest, Father Cajetan Mary de Bergamo, who wrote a book called Humility of Heart, and he writes in it about Satan's first sin. He says that Satan's first sin was a sin of thought where he wanted to be considered equal with God. And yet man, he sins in act because he prefers his own will to God. And this is when we don't sin in thought. And so we must realize that because Satan had the arrogance to think that he wanted to be God, and this is what caused him to fall, we must consider our own actions in this light. Do we, who so often prefer our own will to the will of beauty, the will of good, and the will of being itself, how do we compare with the tempter that made our ancestors to fall? How do we compare with this? And this thought, which I leave you with here, is a very harsh one, but I think that this may lead us to a position where we can, when we need to make changes, change the social institutions and the creative achievements in such a way that brings us to good, because through the embracing of this humility, this understanding, we are grounded in the world to such an extent where we do have a good reason for removing the fence that Chesterton wrote about. But just before I leave you, I want to make you aware of something. I do a great deal of reading, and I have this habit where I will collect together all of the long passages from the writings that I read, and I will place them together on my email address. Now, these are often very long passages in works that many people have never heard of, because I have a very strong interest in the Church Fathers and in ancient philosophy. And so, if you would like access to these, and I will be posting them every day, I will be posting them on Patreon, and if you give the minimum pledge, which is $1 as far as I understand, you can get access to these. It also helps my work on here, and allows me to continue to produce this series on Jordan Peterson's Rules for Life, and for subsequent content after that. So, if you have the money, and you would be willing to spare it, I would very much appreciate a small tip. Thank you very much for watching.